Welcome to the Balanced Blueprints podcast, where we discuss optimal techniques for health and finances and then break it down to create an individualized and balanced plan. I'm your host, John Proper, here with my co-host, Justin Gaines. Well, welcome back, part 3. So we'll just finish up here some quick, easy ways to navigate the grocery store, like you said. If this is the first one I guess you're listening to, we'll just say real quick. The first part, we went over produce, vegetables, ideal, what to buy, what to look for. Then we went over meats and seafoods. And now we're just going to kind of finish going up through the aisles, like Justin said. We will start with next, I believe, after meats is usually dairy. You can have, and I'll put eggs into dairy. So milk, cheeses, eggs. Eggs is a big one. Actually, we'll start with that because that's probably, I forget. I go to the grocery store. It's so easy to think about like what I'm buying as. And when I say think about, I mean I don't think about it because it's so routine at this point. But I know a lot of people go to that egg aisle. They just stare. And they're like, what are all these? Like, why are some $40? Why are some $2? So eggs, top down, working with ideal, is going to be organic, pasture-raised. The wording around here has different regulations, but pasture-raised usually means, I think it's around 108 square feet that they can kind of roam around outside. Again, we talked about this with other meats. It's important that they're living outside, getting a mixture of things they forage like bugs. And then also if they need supplemental grain, really the only reason that organic is important for pasture raised is they're then going to throw them organic supplemental grain. Personally, the eggs I eat on the daily are just local pasture raised. They're not organic because sometimes I put local food higher than conventional organic from the grocery store just because it's from my area, which we've talked about. That's important too. So same thing. If you're at a farmer's market, you can talk to the farmer, buy some local organic pasture-raised eggs. And if you're not, you're going through a grocery store, like we said, the Co-op or Whole Foods, look for the best option is going to be organic pasture-raised. Those might be pretty pricey. So then the next step down, like I just said, that I eat on the daily would just be normal pasture-raised, not organic. But they're still living outside, getting tons of forage. And yeah, so that's where I would start there.
For sure.
The next one, so under that, organic pasture-raised, pasture-raised. Now you're going to probably want, I would ideally go with organic for the rest. So you'd have organic, free range. And these words here, again, all they mean is the amount of space the chicken gets to have is outdoor access. So free range is they get outdoor access. I don't know the exact number for this, but it's much less than pasture-raised. Depending on the company too, this is where companies use wordplay and it's where it can get tricky. So I think that's another benefit of going to the farmers market. Like we talked about last episode, you can even visit the farms. You'll know what the farmer's doing. But at the store, it can be a little trickier because there's big companies. But then I'd go organic free range, then organic cage free, and then you just have conventional eggs after that. And I get it. If you're on if you're trying to do stuff on a budget, eggs are still a great food, so healthy, tons of vitamins and minerals. So I wouldn't say if you can't afford the best eggs, don't eat them. But again, for me, it's like an environmental thing, an animal welfare thing. Even cage free, they're in a barn in no sunlight. They're just packed in there like sardines, living in filth. So just be on the lookout. It's sad that they do market things in terms of they're using words like cage free to kind of trick you in a sense to think, we're taking care of our chickens. And then I've seen some environments where they do not look good. But in terms of eggs, that's the hierarchy I'd go with.
Nice. Yeah, there's a few things in there I didn't realize. The nuances between pasture-raised and free range, even growing up in the industry. These are all newer terms that didn't exist, when I was heavily in the farming industry, actively farming. Now I'm in the industry, but on a different side of things. And yeah, I didn't realize that these terms had such very defined things. And then of course, like you're talking about with the companies, because the USDA doesn't regulate and the FDA doesn't regulate anything outside of the nutrition label or, the organic seals or any of that stuff. You pretty much put whatever you want on these labels, and unless a company does or people do a walkthrough video of your place, you may never get caught on it. So finding that reputable company definitely makes a difference for sure.
And I think that's why they had to almost get so specific with these different terms, because companies were probably starting to abuse them. And then smaller companies were like, well, we don't want to be, lumped in the same category. Like, we're doing better than that. But I agree with you. I think even, don't get turned off by the name if you're going to a farmer's market specifically, because I think a lot of farmers still may be in that old, school mentality, because it's not even that old. It's just these terms are so new, like you said. They may say free range eggs, and don't be like, oh, I'm not buying those because they're not pasture raised. And they could be the most pasture raised chickens in the world, because the farmer's just thinking they're ranging, freely, like roaming freely. So again,
well, and I also wonder too, like what the stipulation is, because like the chickens we have at our farm, we have an old horse barn, and we just caged in. It's now like 3 stalls that are caged in, so the birds can't fly out. And so during the day, they're out roaming. They have access to as much farmland as they want. There's 100 acres there. They never go that far, but they could go and scavenge all over the 100 acres, and then we use some grain at nighttime, and they know that, okay, there's going to be some grain, and we're going to go inside. And that's honestly for predatory risk. If they were outside, coyotes, owls would snatch them up and kill them.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things that my parents sell eggs, and I'm not even sure what phrasing they use on it. But yeah, it becomes, that free range, pasture raised. A lot of farms do it that way, where there's a chicken coop or somewhere that they're able to be under shelter so that there's not a predatory risk. But during the daylight hours, they're out scavenging, doing whatever they want. And ultimately what we do to let them out is we just open the door. And sometimes they don't even want to go out. If
no,
it's not the nicest
not
day.
it's freezing.
Just they just stay right there and they don't even leave.
Right.
And then you come back and 2 hours later they're out. And they're in and out the entire time. So yeah, it's definitely very nuanced, these words and phrasings. And like you're saying, when you go to the local farmers market, you can have those conversations.
And then the other thing I want to mention too, just with eggs before we move on from them, is there's a huge, and I even fell into it for a little bit, but Vital Farms was kind of the most popular egg brand that came out and sold pasture raised eggs basically all over the US. And they're still a good company. I don't want to say that they're not, but what they do is they do feed their chickens, it's either turmeric or paprika, but basically they just feed them that to make the yolks darker. There's this notion that the darker the yolk, the better. And that's usually the case, because when I'm going, like when I went to other countries that they're just raising chickens amazingly, and you eat eggs there, like they're very dark orange yolks. They're not yellow and pale. So that does tend to be true, but it's not always true, because you'll have companies like this that are feeding them certain foods to make their yolks darker. At the local co-op in Albany, there's actually a organic, pasture-raised, soy-free, so they don't feed them any soy, and they're pretty light yellow. But that's, you're not going to beat that quality egg in terms of how it's labeled. And I think it's mainly just because either they're not feeding them something to change the yolk color, and also they're coming from the north, so there's probably a lot less, like you said, they don't want to go outside if it's 4 degrees, just like we don't want to go outside if it's 4 degrees. But it's still a great quality.
That's going to be impacted by nutrient density for sure.
Yeah.
The darker it is, but like you said, there's little nuances here that people can trick the system. The other thing that I would say is the hardness of the shell is
that's what I was going to say next.
Sign of a quality egg.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say as a reference point. If you can't use the yolk, what do you use? And nailed it. So if you're having to do some force to crack that egg, it was obviously some good nutrients in there to build a strong shell.
And one way you can tell that, if you're like, oh, how do I tell the force of this? Is I crack it once on the countertop. Is if it's breaking out and you're having to constantly pick shells out of your food, that's a weak shell, because it's spider webbing. And the membrane on the inside isn't very strong. And then also the shell itself isn't very strong, which is what's causing it to shatter the way it's shattering.
Yeah, definitely. So eggs, superfood, always include them. I eat them daily. And again, do the best you can. I think, like Justin said, the price of conventional ones have actually come up. So try and find that middle ground. And if you can afford the best ones, go for it. Dairy is going to be, so we'll move on to dairy, cheese, milk, butter. Very similar to how I buy my beef. I'm looking for pasture raised. Same thing with the chickens. We're looking for happy hens that live outside in sunshine. We're looking for happy cows that live outside in sunshine. Same thing here. I won't go too much into it. If you want to listen to the last podcast about it, I look for grass-fed, grass-finished, but that doesn't mean if they're finished on a quality grain, that's not bad either. Know your farmer. From the stores, I usually just look for grass-fed, grass-finished because you're not really going to find brands that are saying grass-fed, grain-finished. They know how to market it, where people either just are buying conventional or the grass-fed. So I look for that. Organic when I can. But same thing goes for your milk, cream, sour cream, yogurt. I'm looking for pasture-raised cows that were outside, sunshine. If you're buying conventional from the store, ideally I look for organic dairy. Then I do look for grass-fed, grass-finished as well. So that's how I do my dairy.
Few things on dairy though. So this is going to take us. We're going to have to go a little deeper on this. So dairy, so milks. One, it sounds like we're talking specifically bovine cow dairy right now. So we'll discuss the goat element as well, since goat is actually the number one consumed milk in the world, as opposed to cow's milk, which is number one consumed in the U.S. but not in the world. So we'll touch on that. But also whether it's goat or bovine milk, cow milk, whole milk, 2%. 1% skim milk. Where should we be going with that?
Yeah.
I guess I'll start that with the misnomer of everybody thinks whole milk. They don't know what the percentage is on that. The whole milk generally is 2.5 to 3.5% fat, generally speaking. So the jump from whole to 2% is the same jump, generally speaking, as it is from 2 to 1% and 1 to skim. So we'll get that misinformation out there and make sure we clear that up.
Yeah, it's not 98%.
Right. Yeah, I think the wording sometimes confuses people. Whole milk just means that it hasn't been refined to remove any of the fats. The only thing that's been taken out of it is the cream off the top has been skimmed off of it. But other than that, no process has taken out any of the fats.
Right. All right. So you're right. There's a lot I think I probably missed by lumping them together. So if we go for milk, just plain old milk, I'm looking for whole milk, because there's a lot of studies, a lot of research that shows the benefits of keeping the fat in the milk. That kind of helps with, you may see a lot of studies on the internet that show milk is bad. And a lot of those studies are usually fat-free, low-fat milk. And again, a lot of the studies aren't using quality milk. They're using conventional dairy. So there's a lot of problems with those. But even the ones that keep the fat in it, you're seeing a lot of health benefits and not the negatives. So I always look for whole milk. I never get anything else. And I think this is our next podcast I was thinking about before. We're going to go into saturated fat, how it got demonized and why it's not a problem. So, don't have to worry about whole milk, saturated fat, and the high calories in it. We've even talked about calories before. So that's not something of concern. 2 is I look for non-homogenized. In most states, we can probably assume that you can't get raw, but you can get not homogenized. The reason I start with this stuff and even talk about raw milk is because usually the less processed it is, the easier it is to digest. If people do have problems with milk, I want them to see what milk are they drinking. Are you drinking conventional dairy that's ultra pasteurized, heated up super high, homogenized, cows that were fed terrible diets, had terrible lives? Are we drinking that milk? Are we drinking quality milk? And then this brings in the discussion about goat milk. So another thing I'll look for, I think it's becoming a little more popular these days, especially in yogurt, is A2 cow's milk. This is going to be similar to goat's milk, because goat's milk is an A2 type of milk. And from what I've seen, it's probably something I should go into more of the science behind it. But the layman's terms around it is more similar. A2 milk is more similar to human's milk. So if you have problems with cow milk or conventional dairy, I've seen so many people be able to drink goat's milk instead. And that's probably why it's the leading milk in the world, most consumed. I don't know why America adopted cow's milk as theirs, but sure there's a whole story behind that too, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the answer on that, but I'm sure it's a production issue element.
Yeah, goats don't produce
plus,
a lot of milk.
You need a lot more goats to produce the same amount. The other piece of it too is we have the tillable land to sustain cattle, whereas much of Europe doesn't. And so if you go back to you go way into the history of it, you have, the Alps and areas where there's a lot of rocky mountains and not good tillable land. The goats can live off of that. They can eat the shrubs. They can eat these plants that live in those environments, whereas a cow doesn't. So a cow needs the tillable acreage, needs the larger land, needs more food, needs more tonnage of food to live off of. And so, there's a reason why all of your stories in the Bible talk about goats. And that's because cows would have only been in areas where there's all this land.
Yep.
And so it's because the goats are what, drove a lot of that. Lambs, you look at a lot of these smaller four-legged animals are what they consume over there because they can live on a smaller footprint with eating shrubs and all that sort of stuff. And I would imagine that that's what it is. I'm sure it's a historical ancestral thing of this is how we've always done it. Why would we change?
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems that there's benefits. In the U.S., goat's milk doesn't fall under the federal milk order.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Because goat's milk is so expensive, though.
Well, and it's expensive because that's the price that it needs to be in order for them to actually make a living.
I know.
And so think about that. The price of goat's milk in the U.S. is priced where it should be. The price of dairy milk is priced at half of that.
Yeah. And
we just talked about the amount of input that's needed for a dairy cow versus a goat. It's astronomical. It's absolutely insane. The economics of it just don't make sense.
Yeah. And you brought up a good thing. That's, again, I know we're saying this a lot, but there's so many of them, a topic for another day too. And there's a big argument that we waste a lot of land. This is the environmental argument to raise cattle and cows, but we'll go into this another day. There's so much good research and interesting stuff around land that can't be farmed. It may not be as crazy as Justin was talking about for that only goats can live on, but that ruminant animals are kind of meant for. I'm not going to go much more there. That's a note for.
Yeah, and I won't go much more either, but it's a delicate argument because if your argument is that your argument ultimately has to come to the conclusion that if that's your argument is that they take up so much land, then you have to make the argument of being a vegan, not even a vegetarian, but a vegan, because your argument then is if you're not a vegan and you're making that argument, your argument is for factory farming. Is decrease the amount of footprint that they're using, still consume the products that they're producing in a smaller footprint. That's factory farming. And that is the absolute worst condition to be in versus, so it's one of those things that, if you're going to make that argument, you better practice what you preach or sit there and say that you're okay with factory farming as well, which most people that make that environmental argument have very large hearts and would not say that they're pro-factory farming. So you better be a vegan then.
Yeah. And even vegans then have to be supporting monocrop culture, which is
right. Yes. This is whole. Yeah. And that's why we could break down these arguments a little bit further in its own separate channel. And
we will, because there's so much misinformation about it. And it's a very important topic. And it's not to, I guess, make any one group sound worse than the other. It's just to shine light in terms of, everyone I think is trying to come from a good place, which is trying to help the environment, help the world. But because of, like we talked about earlier, a lot of inputs from companies, powerful companies, and a lot of misinformation, it's hard to sometimes see people that do care about the world be so ignorant to some real facts about what is destroying the environment.
And I think part of it comes from I'll put the blame back on the education system. Is the education system doesn't teach you to think in solutions, it teaches you to think in problems, meaning that the people that are making these arguments, and they're arguments that we even have. It's not that we don't make arguments about this stuff as well.
Right.
But are you coming up with a solution or are you just making an argument? Because when you make an argument, you're implying some sort of solution. So is the solution that you're implying better than the status quo? or better than what you're arguing against? Or are you creating a larger problem down the line?
Yeah.
And just identifying what are you okay with? Because like I said, if you want to make the argument that we shouldn't have cattle and that shouldn't exist because of the large footprint, that's fine. But stick by your argument and live by your argument and become a vegan. And like that's my thing is don't play this whole. And maybe there's definitely a health element to it, but what I'm saying is don't be contradictory in your actions and be like JP Morgan is right now, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, saying, I'm very skeptical of cryptocurrency, but yet he's backing 2 of the 3 companies that are producing ETFs for crypto right now. It's like you're saying don't do it, but yet here you are putting billions of dollars behind it. So it's contradictory.
You can't live a life that's death-free. Like you are always causing death. And if you want to go on to the most basic level, as soon as you go on the grass and step on the ground, you're killing a bug. And so we won't get into the argument.
Yeah, I mean, I would even go to say if you ride in a vehicle that has rubber tires on it, you've contributed to the slaughtering of cattle because there are beef fats, tallows in that harden the rubber in your tires. So if you're a benefactor of a car, mass transportation, any of that sort of stuff, asphalt has it in it. If you're a benefactor of that, like there's no way of getting around it. It is what it is. But the question becomes, are we pushing ourselves to the inevitable brink and death of Earth, or are we pushing ourselves to a prosperous Earth?
Yeah. But
all right, continuing through goat's milk.
Yeah, goat's milk is an A2 type of milk, which is much easier to digest. And I would prefer it. It's very expensive. So I'll look for A2 cow's milk. It's just a certain breed of cows. I think that originally from Europe. So there are some here.
Yeah, so it's jerseys. So it's purebred jerseys. And not all Jersey milk though. And this isn't New Jersey. These are the type of cattle. Jersey cattle. There's not all Jersey cattle produce A2 milk. But Jersey cattle are the only breed of cattle that will produce A2 milk. So they can. Yeah,
you'll see those names together a lot, like
right.
Jersey A2 milk.
Right. Because I'm 99% positive that Jersey cattle are the only ones that still maintain the purity in genetics to produce the A2 milk.
Yeah. And then I'll just talk about, this is an aisle item, but my top milk, if someone is maybe healing, cutting out dairy for a specific reason, there are applications for that. While I do think if you're healthy, dairy should be part of your diet. But if you're cutting it out, coconut milk would be my go-to. It usually has the least amount of additives, but I'll always look at one that has no additives. It's usually, I think it makes more sense, coconut milk, than getting milk from almonds or macadamias or what are the other, oat milk, which is mind-blowing sometimes. So my go-to would be coconut milk, because just for simplistic reasons, the farming practices are mainly going to be better. There's going to be way less chemicals. And I think logically it just makes more sense. But that's an aisle item. Alternative milks can be done a whole different episode. So dairy, eggs, we talked about milk, yogurt.
Frozen foods probably are
frozen. So I don't want frozen fruits to get a bad rep, or if not frozen fruits, but frozen foods in general. This is, again, just an important thing. We're getting into foods that have an ingredient label. So just be conscious of this label. We can't go through every food. So just be conscious of this label. And we'll give some basic guidelines. I know Justin said this maybe on or off air before, but look at how many ingredients. If you can't pronounce an ingredient because it's some super long chemical, a name with, numbers and stuff, it's like sodium benzoate 159, it's probably something that you can put back on the shelf. And a lot of people like to say, oh, don't have to worry about it. It's so minuscule. It's like, it is minuscule, but there's also a package right next to it without those. So I'm just going to do the option of, I don't need those.
Right. And the other part too is it's minuscule per serving.
Yeah.
But how many servings are you eating at a time, and how consistently are you eating these? Because that's going to all build up in your system.
Right.
And the other thing I'll back up to is because in a portion of the frozen food aisle, you'll have whole foods that won't have ingredients on them. Yeah. Those are obviously, we talked about in the first episode, where freezing those isn't losing any nutritional value. They're great options, especially if you want something for a meal and it's out of season, frozen food aisle is a great place to go get something that's been frozen right when it was fresh, locked in all those nutrients, and hasn't been negatively impacted by deterioration due to age.
Yeah. Like Justin said, we did talk about this either in part 1 or 2, but freezing is a great method for preserving, whether you're picking your own fruit and freezing it at your house, or you are going to the store. And if you're going through the freezer aisle, start with those frozen foods that are, again, organic and are whole foods. It's like frozen spinach, frozen blueberries, frozen mango chunks. And this is what we talked about before too. If you're living in a northern hemisphere region or very southern hemisphere where there's strong seasonal changes, right now we're in winter here, this is where I'll look for more frozen foods than fresh foods, because I think it makes more sense that if you can find even local frozen food, which is hard, but like if we're in New York, we can find blueberries from Maine. I think that's a better option than eating fresh blueberries that were flown in from across the world, again, for health reasons and environmental reasons. So this is where our frozen foods are going to come in a lot more handy. I'll eat more of them in the winter because it's a way that food gets preserved. And start with whole foods. Don't really have to check the ingredients there because what's on the front is what's on the back. Then if you're going into, I wouldn't even say really to be buying too many pre-mixed meals or pre-made frozen meals, but there are some good brands, and we talked about healthy eating out options. So I can't say there's no healthy frozen meal options, but again, just apply that, look at the ingredient list, make sure it's good ingredients.
Right. And one of the things that I do too is when you find those good brands, having a couple of frozen food, good brand meals in the fridge or freezer if they're frozen, fridge if they're pre-made and in the fridge aisle, but having those on hand so that I could eat out or I'm headed home anyways, and this is only going to take me 10 minutes to prepare. I know that's better than going to McDonald's or going to one of these fast food chains. So having those on hand, sometimes it's the lesser of two evils. If you have a really good product, you can have that instead of going and buying something that's just being processed in a terrible environment.
Right. Yeah, we don't want to make it sound like it is that bad, because if you cook a meal and you freeze it, what's the difference of a company's doing the same thing with good ingredients? There's one, I think 99.9% sure it's called Kevin's Meals, but it's like paleo frozen meals. And you won't find a bad ingredient in terms of no bad oils, no bad fillers, gums. They only have like 3 options, but still, like Justin said, if you buy them and have them in your freezer for those pinch, you're in a pinch situations, they're going to be perfect to get you out of it. So you're not missing a meal or choosing a worse option.
Right.
All right. I think that's.
And then you have so then we have the main aisles, the dry good aisles.
Yeah. So
generally are about the same rules,
Generally for frozen, and aisles about the same rules. We can't go through every ingredient. So look for food items, again, that are single ingredient items. And just to name a few that are in the aisles, all of your dry spices. Like just because it's in the aisle, doesn't mean it's bad, but single ingredient. Canned fish, sardines, salmon, tuna. Those are aisle items, coconut milk, that are single ingredients. And then from there, everything else, if I eat bread, so I don't eat too much bread. If I do, it's homemade. But things like bread, crackers, more snack items, even condiments, those are the things that you're really going to want to just flip the bottle over. Don't trust anything that's on the front. We've talked about this in the last part. Flip the bottle over. Just look at the ingredients. The things you're going to run into here are just look out for tons of added sugar, ones that have a bunch of seed oils added to it, because nowadays there's many options that don't have them. So just pick those, and foods with tons of preservatives. So maybe we'll go into a bunch of things to look out for in another episode, but really just do your due diligence of flipping the bottle over, look at the ingredients, making sure they're things known to you. And I usually do pick organic stuff out of the middle aisles as well. So.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think that wraps up our grocery haul.
Thanks for listening to our podcast.
We hope this helps you on your balance freedom journey.
Please share your thoughts in the comments section below.
Until next time, stay balanced.